Message in the dark. Loyalty to the Emperor is paramount. Would you obey no matter the cost? Or is there a line you would not cross? The Inquisitor asked. By the dim light of the private office, he was very intimidating. I'm a loyal guardsman. I swore an oath to defend the Imperium, no matter the cost, I stammered. He pushed a blank piece of paper across the desk in front of me. He fixed me with his steely gaze before speaking again. I want to understand why you are standing here, when so many others are not. I want a full report. Start from the beginning and be thorough, as if your life depends on it, because it very well may. Yesterday was my first deployment to active duty. The Hive City of Acheron had been under relentless assault by the forces of chaos and corruption for months. Those infected with the walking pox would smash against the Hive like a living wave, leaving destruction and death in their wake. They were always repelled, but each time they pushed deeper into the Hive. I left the forward command post for the front lines by a transport. I was nervous and felt like I was going to be sick all over my new boots, but I tried not to let it show. I repeated the guard primers in my head, and I told myself I was ready for whatever lay ahead. The brakes on the ramshackle transport screeched as it came to an abrupt halt. The 20 or 30 other fresh-faced youths in the hold all lurched to the front to fall into a disheveled human pile. I had just managed to drag myself out of the press of bodies when the doors opened and I was pushed outside. I was momentarily blinded as the twin sons of Maron Prime were at their summit, and it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Hive Acheron loomed behind us, a sprawling mountain of steel and rockcrete, set in a barren desert of sand and baked earth. It was a stark contrast to the serene landscapes I'd known back on my home world. I was from a green, agri-world that had never felt as distant as it did at that moment. Everything around me was in hectic disarray. 3 massive artillery cannons, their barrels, longer than the transport we'd been crammed into, roared to life with deafening booms that made the ground shake each time they hurtled ordnance toward distant enemy positions. In the midst of the commotion, officers in ornate hats barked orders and herded soldiers into formations, their voices laden with authority and urgency. There were civilians too, dressed in overalls or ragged old clothes, as every able body was being marshaled to stand against the relentless assault of the walking pox that blighted Maron Prime. They toiled frantically to dig trenches or piled up sandbags with grim determination. Sergeant Cale Drayton, a grizzled veteran with a jagged scar across one eye, noticed me and waved me over. He stood tall with a striking presence that exuded the confidence of a veteran soldier. He looked like he belonged on a recruitment poster, his stern, chiseled features framed by closely cropped graying hair that added an air of wisdom and experience to his imposing figure. His deep, resonant voice was often the source of encouragement, providing solace to young soldiers who had never before tasted the horrors of war. He had taken a shine to me when he realized we came from the same far-off agri-world. Our imperial tithe was largely paid in grain and grox, so there wasn't many of us that had enlisted. It turned out he was from the equator while I was from the northern continent, about 4,000 miles away. But in galactic terms, it was like being from the same hometown. I'm not afraid to admit that he was something of a hero to me. He'd been my mentor in basic training, the one who'd molded me into a soldier. I owed my life to him, and I admired his unwavering dedication to the Imperium. "Thorne, you made it," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of artillery fire and shouting. "About time. We're stretched thin, but we've got a fighting chance. This is where you'll prove yourself, lad." He led me to where I'd be stationed, then gave me a hearty slap on the back that was a tad too firm, and I stumbled forward. "We sent them packing before, and we'll do it again. Remember what I taught you, and you'll be just fine. Don't piss your pants and the first round's on me." He winked at me, made the sign of the Aquila, and left to attend to his other duties. My trench was near a sewage outlet for the expansive slums that formed the base of the Hive City. It was a long, hastily dug line, 5 foot deep with rough, uneven walls of poorly packed soil. Bulging sacks of sand and grit had been piled up at regular intervals by the desperate defenders for them to stand on to shoot over the top. Inside was a mixture of soldiers, ranging from experienced veterans to raw recruits like myself. Among them, I recognized a few familiar faces from my training squad. Sophia Renwick, a skilled marksman even at her young age, had a quiet determination in her eyes. She gave me a silent, reassuring nod that I returned. She had an uncanny ability to keep her cool under fire, and I'd learned a lot from her during training. Beside her was Grizz. He was a hulking figure whose arms were thicker than my legs. He was a jovial giant, quick with a joke to ease the tension. Lastly was Eleanor, a friendly girl with auburn hair and a distinctive pattern of burn scars on one side of her face. We would often joke together about how bad the rations were. Not when any of the officers or commissars could hear, of course. And now all of us were stationed together for our first deployment, defending Acheron. It felt like we were Imperial heroes from some holovid. Sergeant Drayton reappeared and put a lasgun in my hands. Then I took my place on the line with all the others. I'm not sure if it was the reassuring heft of the weapon in my hands or being side by side with people I knew, but I didn't feel sick anymore. I actually felt ready. I had to trust in what Drayton had taught me, trust that I would act when the time came, and trust everyone else down the trench would do the same. And I did. So we readied ourselves and waited. Time stretched on, and eventually the suns dipped below the distant horizon, casting long shadows that mingled with the chill of the approaching night. As we huddled in the darkness of the trench, a heavy silence hung over us. I suppose each of us was lost in their own thoughts. Even the heavy artillery paused in its unrelenting bombardment and fell quiet for a time. Above, Marin Prime's solitary moon cast its silvery glow over the barren expanse of desert, lending an eerie, ethereal quality to the desolation. I'd never considered deserts to be pretty, but it was, in its own way. We scanned the horizon, our eyes tracing the shimmering dunes of the hauntingly still wasteland that stretched out before us. Sophia shouted a sighting from further up the line. I squinted, and I saw for myself a scene that will haunt my nightmares. From the edge of the horizon, like a surreal nightmare given life, they emerged. An endless sea of twisted abominations, their bloated, pustule-ridden bodies moving with eerie, mindless determination. The desert, once a desolate canvas of sand, was now tainted by the presence of a seething mass of corruption and disease. The Poxwalkers, each a grotesque echo of a former human life, shuffled forward. The dread they emanated almost palpable. Their eyes, what remained of them, glowed with a malevolence as they fixed their unholy gazes on our trench, where my fellow soldiers and I waited. I tightened my grip on my lasgun as my bravado began to evaporate at the sight of the enemy, and the cold, heavy fear returned to the pit of my stomach. I jumped as the artillery once again boomed to life behind me. Explosions erupted amongst the sea of infected and lit the battlefield with brief, brilliant bursts of red and yellow. Poxwalkers were blasted up into the air by the shelling to rain back down as broken human pieces. A cheer went up along the trench, and I actually laughed, confident in the superiority of our big guns. But I underestimated the sheer numbers and tenacity of the enemy. Regardless of how many were pulverized by the shelling, the rest just kept coming. They seemed to dance with malevolent glee as they drew nearer, their emaciated limbs swaying in surreal harmony as they advanced, as if the violent, explosive bombardment was nothing more than a dazzling firework display to welcome them to some grand celebration. The direction of the wind changed, and the air became thick with the stench of decay, a nauseating mixture of rotting flesh and gunpowder. If I hadn't actually witnessed it myself, I don't think I would have believed the true horror of the walking pox. Their bodies were riddled with injuries and disease that by all logical accounts should have killed them all long ago. Yet they moved onward, inexorable and unyielding. Struggling to accept what I saw, I slapped my own face. I suppose I was hoping it was just a bad dream, but my stinging face told me the horror in front of me was all too real. The unholy chorus of the oncoming Poxwalkers, with their unnerving cries, grew louder than the cacophony of artillery barrages. Their moans and groans seemed to claw their way into the darkest corners of my mind, sending shivers down my spine and raising the fine hairs on the back of my neck. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fidgeted nervously, my weapon suddenly feeling unfamiliar, like a foreign presence in my trembling hands. "Take aim!" I heard Sergeant Drayton's commanding voice bellow out from somewhere behind me. I diligently did as I was told and got into a firing position, grateful to be doing something at last. I looked down the sights of my lasgun. There were so many Poxwalkers crowded together, their gnarled hands outstretched and grasping for their next victim, that it was near impossible to miss. Fire! I pulled the trigger in actual battle for the first time. It spat red beams of death towards the enemy, each bolt burning deep holes in their bloated and rotten bodies. Despite the grievous wounds I inflicted, the Poxwalkers were disgustingly resilient, ignoring wounds that would have killed a regular man. But with enough shots, I felled my first infected. I gasped and realized that I had been holding my breath the whole time. I took a deep breath and went back to work. I fired until my power pack ran dry. I replaced it with the spare and kept blasting at the Poxwalkers. But despite the incredible losses they suffered, their advance didn't even slow. "Fix bayonets," Sergeant Drayton ordered, as with grim inevitability they reached us. They enveloped our position like a tide of filth and decay. Their rotting hands reached out, grasping for any shred of life, their revolting faces twisted with an unearthly hunger. With a cry of defiance, I lanced one with my bayonet and kicked it away. Then a second dropped down, and a third dropped down on top of that, knocking it down. I jabbed at them both as they lay sprawled on top of each other. Then I spared a fleeting glance down the trench at my comrades. Sophia's sharp shooting skills were useless in the close-quarters combat. She got some good shots off, but a Poxwalker, with half its head blown off, swatted her lasgun aside and barreled into her. It sank its talon like shriveled fingers into her flesh, and she screamed. Grizz turned his lasgun around and, holding it by the barrel, swung it like a club as he ran towards her. With his sheer strength, he cracked open skulls like they were over-ripened fruit. But within moments, the trench was choked full of Poxwalkers, and there wasn't enough room to swing. Sophia disappeared beneath a pile of attackers, and Grizz reached out to her. "Sophia!" he called, before a dozen clawed hands and biting teeth silenced him forever. I didn't have the chance to see what happened to Eleanor as I became surrounded and had to fight for my own life. A guardsman I didn't know next to me threw his lasgun at the infected and tried to flee. He managed to climb halfway out the trench before a bolt shot from our rear lines struck him, and he fell back into the trench, dead. As the Poxwalkers pressed against me, I tried to back up and tripped over the lifeless body of a fallen soldier. I fell, and my lasgun slipped from my hands to land just out of reach. Panic welled up within me as I fumbled for anything I could use as a weapon. My trembling hand closed around a grenade, still clutched tightly in the stiff fingers of the guardsman I had fallen over. With no time to think, I took it and hurled the explosive towards the approaching abominations. It bounced off of them to land somewhere out of sight. A Poxwalker reached out and clawed deeply into my leg. Then the grenade unleashed the Emperor's fury and exploded. The resulting shockwave must have hit a weakness in the hastily constructed earthen fortifications. The walls of that entire section of trench crumbled and collapsed in an avalanche of dirt and debris that buried everything, including me. Eventually I regained my senses, but everything was silent and black. I felt hot and I couldn't move. Was I dead? Is this what death is like? I thought. I coughed and spat out a mouthful of bitter-tasting soil. The fleeting rush of elation when I realized I was still alive was quickly replaced with panic when I understood I had been buried alive in a mass grave. My breath came in short, desperate draws, the tight press of earth preventing me from sucking in a whole lungful of the stale air from the small air pocket I was apparently trapped in. Unsure how I was still alive, but knowing I wouldn't stay that way for long, my heart pounded in my chest as I fought to break free. At first, nothing happened. My feeble attempts at motion were useless as the weight of the earth pressed down on me. My limbs ached with the effort, but desperate to live, I kept going, and slowly my arms started to move from where they were pinned. I managed to pull my left arm into the small pocket my head and part of my torso was in, and started clawing desperately at the earth above me. With a final surge of strength, I forced myself upwards and burst through the surface and into the morning light of Maron Prime's twin suns. I greedily gulped in the taste of sweet fresh air, then flopped to the side exhausted, still buried from the waist down. Once I caught my breath, I extracted myself completely and dusted myself off. I was covered in grime and filth, my uniform torn and muddied, but I was alive. I looked around and saw the battle was long since over. Dead Poxwalkers and soldiers were strewn all over the place. "Hello, anyone!" I shouted, but there was no reply. Then I noticed it. Not far from where I had pulled myself from the collapsed trench, the soil rhythmically pulsed. I dived over and began to dig with my bare hands. My fingers scraped against the soil, and I could hear the muffled sounds of groaning below. "Hang in there, I've almost got you." I dug harder, uncovering the green uniform of a fellow guardsman. I got a firm grip on the collar of their uniform and pulled, but as the head broke the surface, I reeled back in horror. It was the bloated and ghastly head of a Poxwalker, its face twisting as it gnashed its teeth at me in a ravenous frenzy. I picked up a nearby rock in both hands and brought it crushing down on the exposed thing's skull. I hit it over and over until its desperate attempts to bite me with its snapping jaws finally ceased. I dropped the bloodied stone and staggered away, looking for signs of other survivors amidst the ruins of the trench, being more wary of any bodies that could be newly infected. It looked like the collapse was localized to where I'd been fighting, but the rest of the line was filled with the bodies of the dead. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized the familiar form of Sergeant Drayton slumped against an outcrop. I rushed to his side. He was badly injured, and I gently patted his shoulder. "Sergeant?" I whispered, my voice trembling with concern. I feared he was dead, and a wave of relief washed over me when he slowly opened his eyes. He turned to me. His gaze was distant, as if he were peering through me, but his movements were human, not the rabid jerks of the infected. Thorne, is that you?" he asked, his voice weak and filled with disbelief. Yes, it's me," I replied, overjoyed. He reached over and touched my face. How are you still alive?" "The trench collapsed," I began. "We were fighting. A Poxer was about to bite my face off when the whole thing fell in. I just managed to pull myself out." He chuckled weakly. "Ha, I knew you wouldn't run. You're a good kid. I guess it's true when they say you can't keep a good grower down." "Sergeant, where is everyone?" He sighed and motioned to the trench's grim surroundings. "Dead or pulled back. You, my boy, are the last man standing." I shook my head. "You and me both." "No, not me. I'm afraid my standing days are done," he said somberly. "Don't be like that," I protested, attempting to help him up. But when I tried, he howled in pain and I quickly released him. I hesitated, not sure what to do. "Top pocket," Drayton said. I unbuttoned the top pocket of his fatigues and handed him the notepad and pen that were inside. He quickly began to write something down, tore off the page, and folded it up before handing me the note. "Listen to me, Thorne. I need you to do something for me. This is the last order I'll ever give you. This message is of vital importance. You need to get it to the forward command post. There is an inquisitor there by the name of Galen. It's for his eyes only. Understand?" he said. "But Sergeant," I began, my voice choked with emotion, but before I could finish, Drayton cut me off. "Do you understand? This is an order, guardsman." "Sir, yes, sir," I relented. "You're a good soldier. Make me proud." Tears welled in my eyes, and I wiped them away with a dirty sleeve. I will, I promise," I said, as the light of life faded from his eyes. I offered a prayer for his immortal soul, tears flowing freely down my face. He was a great man and had died an imperial martyr. I knew he'd be by the Emperor's side, watching down on me, and I was determined to honor his memory by carrying out his final orders, or die trying. I stuffed the note in my pocket and found a las gun with half a charge still left. With the almost unbearable weight of loss and responsibility, I made my way into the slums of the Underhive. The edge of the slums were open to the sky, but were cloaked in a thick layer of smog that made the filth-covered streets dark and dingy, even at this time of day. The narrow walkways and boulevards that had been a bustling hub of human activity when I passed through on my way to the front had become a desolate wasteland. The loud and rowdy streets as hushed as a mausoleum. The towering, dilapidated buildings loomed like monuments to human desperation, their haphazard silhouettes casting elongated skeletal shadows across the crumbling pavement. Their walls were scarred by las fire and blood splatters. I scanned every window and doorway I passed with my raised las gun. It didn't take me long to start encountering the dead. It was more like a walk through the slaughterhouse of an abattoir than an imperial city. The twisted remnants of humanity, soldier and civilian, young and old, were strewn about in contorted poses like forgotten dolls in a child's nightmare. Some had died in futile attempts to fend off the Poxwalkers, while others had succumbed to the plague with silent despair. I tried to step carefully over and amongst the mangled corpses, giving an even wider berth to those that could be infected for fear they might reanimate and leap up to sink their teeth into me. Eventually, I reached the Underhive proper. It was like going underground with only the faint glow of flickering lumens to eerily light the way. Suddenly, a subtle scuttling drew my attention. I spun in a panicked reflex, my lasgun's beam lancing out in an iridescent fury. The rat thing, about 3 foot long with 2 tails, disintegrated into a lump of scorched fur and bone, the stench of burnt rodent hair hardly noticeable over the acrid odor of the Underhive's decay. I tried to hurry on, but got tangled up in the disemboweled innards of an unfortunate Underhiver as their entrails got wrapped around a boot. I tried to kick them off, but slipped on the blood-soaked floor and fell to land face to face with a dead woman. Her lifeless eyes bore into me in silent accusation. It was my job to keep them safe, and I had failed them. I had failed all of them. I jumped back up to my feet and rushed away. I didn't look back and tried not to think about all the lives that had ended so brutally all around me. Up ahead, I heard the sound of tearing and ripping just around the corner. I thought it might be another one of those rat things, but taking no chances, I decided to cautiously scout it out first. My heart sank as I peered around a corner and saw a large group of Poxwalkers. Their vile, bloated figures huddled around a banquet of guardsmen's remains. The macabre feasting was accompanied by sickening wet sounds as they tore into flesh and gnawed on bones with unnerving determination. My throat tightened with revulsion. Lucky for me, the Poxwalkers were oblivious to everything but their ghoulish feast and hadn't noticed me. There were too many of them for me to handle alone, so I decided to look for another way to the command post. As quietly as I could, I backed away, afraid that even the slightest noise or sudden movement could draw their attention. I tried my best to navigate the unfamiliar labyrinth of the Underhive. My lasgun remained at the ready, my trembling finger on the trigger. I turned another corner and onto a thoroughfare with stalls selling various foods, skewered on sticks or wrapped in some kind of grimy paper. At the far end was a checkpoint manned by green-clad figures. My heart soared to see fellow guardsmen. "Hey, am I glad to see you? I was starting to think I was the only one," I shouted out. They slowly turned to face me, and as the light of the stall's illuminated signs washed over their swollen and disfigured faces, I got a good look at them. Their skin was pallid and mottled, their eyes vacant and glazed with an otherworldly malevolence. In different places on their bodies, their bones had grown into spikes that jutted out from different places. Most notably, their hands, where their finger bones protruded from each finger like claws. Their mouths opened, slack-jawed, and they shrieked as they sprinted towards me, their taloned hands outstretched. I gasped as I realized I had made a grave mistake. They were Poxwalkers now. They were the enemy, and my voice had drawn their ravenous attention. I brought my lasgun back up and fired, sending searing red beams of energy to light up the street. The first bolt lanced a Poxwalker through the chest, causing it to convulse and collapse to the ground. A smouldering hole burnt right through it. My second struck a Poxwalker squarely in the head, but it kept coming, a hole the size of my fist in its face. But my third shot sent it spiraling to the floor where it lay motionless and still. But there were more of them, and they charged with reckless abandon. My lasgun delivered the Emperor's mercy with each pull of the trigger. The beams pierced through diseased flesh that had already become putrefied and rotten. The last 3 reached me before I could shoot them. I sidestepped as the first lunged at me, its clawed hands raking the empty air, and fired at it until it fell backwards. Another grabbed a hold of my lasgun, so I drew my bayonet and stabbed it into its eye before shoving it back and hosing it down with lasfire. The last Poxwalker stumbled over the body of one of its felled comrades, and I brought the butt of my lasgun back to slam into its extended jaw with a crack. The impact knocked it back, and I followed up with a point-blank shot to its head, and it abruptly dropped to the floor, like a puppet with its strings cut. After the grisly fight with the Poxwalkers, I had a moment to catch my breath and take in my surroundings. The Underhive's labyrinthine slums stretched out before me in a tangled web of shadowed alleys and decrepit tunnels, each more than likely harboring more of the infected. By not taking the direct route and trying to find my way through the unfamiliar hive, I was increasing the likelihood of meeting a gruesome end and, God Emperor forbid, joining the ranks of the infected. I looked for a solution to my situation, and found it in the form of a rusted old transport vehicle. It was idling in a side road, its original occupant having met an unfortunate end at the hands of the Poxwalkers. I looked over the controls, and it didn't appear much different from the field rotavators I had piloted back in the fields. With as much reverence as I could afford in my haste, I pulled the body from the front cabin and took its place in the driver's seat. After a few experimental twists of knobs, the engine rumbled to life. I was sure the noise would attract a lot of unwanted attention, so I quickly shifted it into drive and accelerated back the way I had come. The transport vehicle thundered down the Underhive's claustrophobic streets, its engine roaring like an angry beast. I clung to the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination. I returned to the ghoulish congregation of Poxwalkers that was still feasting on my fellow guardsmen. This time, with the engine roaring, there would be no hiding. They all looked up to see what the racket was, gore dribbling from their mouths. With a surge of adrenaline, I floored the accelerator and pointed the vehicle right at them. Its old worn tires screeching against the rough terrain and bounced over the debris and bodies that littered the thoroughfare. Though it was hard going, the transport gained speed with each passing second. The Poxwalkers ran towards me, like I knew that they would, their putrid faces contorted in anticipation of fresh meat. With a deafening crash, I ploughed right into the heart of the oncoming horde. The impact flung bodies up into the air, like grotesque marionettes that trailed blood and viscera in their wake. The transport lurched violently as it crunched over their twisted forms. Then I erupted from the other side of the throng of infected and just kept going. The Poxwalkers pursued me, but despite their unholy determination, they couldn't keep up with the battered, carnage-covered transport. I made good time, and it wasn't long before I was within view of the command post. Like the rest of the hive I'd passed through, it was very different to the bustling scene I had left behind the previous day. The forward command post had been cobbled together from scavenged materials and reinforced with steel plating. The architecture was a haphazard amalgamation of makeshift barricades and fortified positions, but the hastily constructed fortress had been teeming with soldiers, its palisades and mustering grounds filled with a sense of optimism that victory was within reach. But now, the place was transformed into a grim and dire setting. The once sturdy barricades and fortifications had been battered and torn aside. Huge, still smoking areas were scarred by fire damage, and the crimson-stained battlements were a silent testament that the command post had fared only marginally better than the front. The lines and lines of disciplined soldiers were also absent. In their place were only 2 sentries that I could see. They stepped out of a tiny guard's hut and pointed their weapons at me as I brought the vehicle to a stop. They appeared weary and on edge. Their uniforms were disheveled and marked by signs of prolonged combat, and the look in their bloodshot eyes told me to take care. I didn't want to get shot by a twitchy sentry when I was so close to completing my mission, so I left my lasgun behind and slowly got out of the transport. "Halt! State your business!" one of the sentries demanded, his voice tense, his weapon trained on me. I raised my hands and tried to look as unthreatening as possible. "I'm Trooper Thorne. I was deployed yesterday. I've got a dispatch from the front." The sentry exchanged a brief, skeptical glance with his comrade. "Don't be stupid. Ain't nobody left at the front. They're all dead. Everyone north of the slump is dead. I don't know what your game is, but best you get back on your way, son." "It's true," I said. "I think I'm the sole survivor. I have a vital dispatch from Sergeant Cale Drayton for Inquisitor Galen." "Prove it," the second sentry insisted. I reached into my pocket, retrieving the note Sergeant Drayton had given me before he had passed, and held it up for them to see. When one of them reached out to take it, I snatched it away. "It's for Inquisitor Galen's eyes only," I explained. "You're either really brave or really stupid. Now hand it over." "No, I can't!" They seized both my arms and slammed me against the wall of the guard's hut. I tightened my grip as they started to pry my fingers open. "It's for Inquisitor Galen only. It's for Inquisitor Galen," I pleaded. "What is the meaning of this?" A deep and resounding voice came from the shadows, and the sentries froze. Inquisitor Galen strode into the light, a half-eaten ration bar in one hand. His authoritative presence was undeniable as the sentries released me and gave a hasty imperial salute. He had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had a well-groomed beard framing his mouth. He wore a long black and silver jacket and a red sash with the symbol of the Inquisition emblazoned upon it in gold. He exuded an air of both scholar and warrior, and I couldn't help but feel both in awe and slightly unnerved by his presence. "Well, you see, sir," one of the sentries began to explain. Inquisitor Galen held up a hand to silence him. "Enough. I heard everything. Message." He clicked his fingers and held out a hand. I passed him the crumpled note, which he unfolded and read. When he was done, he fixed his piercing gaze on me as he finished the ration bar. "What's your name, guardsman?" he asked. "Thornes, sir." "Have you read the contents of this message?" "No, sir, I would never. Sergeant Drayton insisted it was for your eyes only," I said as his scrutiny of me intensified. "Very well," the Inquisitor said. "Follow me." He led me to a small private office where I gave this report. Galen read what I wrote before putting it in one of the pockets of his long coat. He pressed a button on a terminal on the desk, and a young woman's voice answered. "Inform Marshal Willem I'm returning to my ship. I will be in contact again," he said, before he stood and briskly walked past me and through the door. Just past the threshold, he stopped. "Well, come along, guardsman." "Sir?" I asked. "While there might not be much we can do for this hive," Galen explained, "there is still much work to be done in the Emperor's service, and there could be a place for you, if you wish it." Without another word, he left. I hurried after him and into the service of the Emperor's Inquisition. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please give a like, and don't forget to subscribe to become a part of our ever-growing Imperium of subscribers.